There's a new generation 32-inch 4K QD-OLED panel hitting store shelves in 2026. It promises better brightness and better ambient light reflectivity than previous generations. I'm not talking about a massive improvement here, this is largely the same technology, but as a gamer, is it worth getting the new 2026 version or sticking to existing models that first debuted in 2024? That's what I'll be exploring today by looking at the Asus ROG Swift PG32UCDM3. Now, like with a lot of monitors, the name here is a little confusing. This is the third generation PG32UCDM, following on from the second gen PG32UCDMR and the first gen PG32UCDM. The second gen R model was a minor revision that included DisplayPort 2.1 and a few other features, but otherwise used the same panel as the first gen model. So throughout this review, when I describe the benefit the new panel provides, that is relative to both the first and second gen models. One of the two main changes with this new variant is the inclusion of what Asus call Black Shield film. This is a brand name for a new optional film that Samsung Display can apply to a QD-OLED panel that is designed to reduce ambient light reflectivity. Asus claims this boosts the perceived black level by up to 40% in a well-lit environment. The film also improves surface hardness by 2.5 times, moving from a hardness rating of 2H to 3H, which will make the screen more scratch resistant, a minor issue with first-gen QD-OLEDs. The benefit this new Black Shield film provides is similar to what I saw last month with the 360Hz V-Stripe QD-OLED ultrawides. When you put this new 2026 32-inch 4K panel up against the 2026 34-inch ultrawide, the way both screens handle ambient light is very similar. In moderately lit environments like a typical room with indoor artificial lights, blacks look pretty good, and there's less of the grey tone you got with the previous version of this panel. The slight reddish-purple tint is also reduced, so overall there is a definite blackness improvement, and this makes the OLED panel more effective at displaying deep blacks across a wider range of lighting conditions. On the 32-inch 4K panel, the improvement to ambient light reflectivity, going from the 2024 panel to the 2026 panel, is not as pronounced as when I compared the 2026 ultrawide to the first gen ultrawide. This is because the very first 32-inch 4K QD-OLEDs already featured some reflectivity improvements relative to the first gen ultrawides. There's definitely an improvement here. I prefer the way the 2026 panel looks when gaming in brighter rooms. It's just not as significant of an improvement as we saw on the ultrawides. However, while this is a good improvement and I'm glad to see progress being made, this new film applied to the panel doesn't fix the ambient light reflectivity issue entirely. Glossy WOLED panels still handle ambient light noticeably better, with deeper blacks in bright conditions. QD-OLEDs handle direct reflections better, so the panel has less of a mirror-like finish, but I still think WOLED panels look better overall and have deeper blacks in more lighting conditions. The other main change with the new 2026 panel is an increase in brightness specification. The PG32UCDM3 has received Display HDR True Black 500 certification, up from True Black 400 previously. Higher brightness output is required to hit the True Black 500 spec, so let's explore the performance impact. The biggest improvement is to full screen brightness in both the SDR and HDR modes. The original model topped out at 245 nits full screen in SDR. That is increased to 295 nits with the 2026 variant, up 20%. Around 250 nits was already pretty good for most use cases, but nearly 300 nits is even better. It's a nice and bright panel for SDR apps. For HDR content, we see a similar improvement to full screen brightness, which is increased from 260 to 310 nits, approximately 20% higher again. 10% window brightness is also higher, going from 470 nits to 536 nits in the best mode, which is a 14% increase. However, peak brightness capabilities at a 2% window are unchanged, so the panel still tops out at 1000 nits or thereabouts. 5% window brightness is only slightly higher on the new panel, so generally, for small highlights, the new panel performs the same as the old panel. These are very similar results to what we saw from the 27-inch 1440p 500Hz panel that debuted in 2025, but it falls short of what the latest ultrawide is capable of. The 34-inch 360Hz panel has similar full screen and 10% brightness, but hits 1300 nits at a 2% window and 950 nits at a 5% window. Essentially, there are now 3 brightness classes that Samsung Display offer across their QD-OLED gaming panels. The base spec is Display HDR 400 class with 250 nits full screen, 470 nits 10%, and a peak of 1000 nits. That's what the original PG32UCDM offered, along with most other QD-OLEDs. The middle spec is Display HDR 500 with increased large window brightness, but the same 1000 nits peak. That's what the new 2026 32-inch 4K panel provides, along with the 1440p 500Hz panel. And the top spec is also Display HDR 500, but with 1300 nits peak, only available in the latest ultrawides for now. As only some parts of the brightness curve have increased, there are mixed real scene results comparing the 2026 model to the 2024 model. In the peak 1000 mode, console HDR, bright scenes can be 10 to 20% brighter, but other scenes can be unchanged, leading to an overall average across our 8 test scenes that's only 8% higher. QD-OLED panel dimming is also present here, so the new model does not solve this long-running problem with Samsung Display's OLED offering. You'll actually find bigger increases if you opt to use the True Black mode, which is the more accurate mode across all scenes and does not feature panel dimming, but has capped brightness. The new 500 True Black mode raises the brightness cap from about 450 nits to about 530 nits, so peak brightness is higher, while also giving you increased large window brightness. This leads to average brightness that is 18 to 20% higher than previous True Black configurations. The benefits to screen coding and brightness should apply to all new 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLEDs that opt to use this new panel variant, but specific to the PG32UCDM3, Asus have also introduced several new features that were not available in the original model. One is that they have bumped the DisplayPort spec up to 2.1 UHBR20, allowing you to use the display at its full 4K 240Hz without DSC. This was also available in the R variant. This doesn't have any real-world benefit to gamers. The experience is functionally identical to DisplayPort 1.4 that uses DSC, but it keeps the Asus model up to speed with other newer models that also implement DP 2.1. Asus have also included their handy Neo proximity sensor in the UCDM3, which is not a brand new feature as we've seen it implemented across many of Asus's 2025 models, but it wasn't included with the original UCDM. This sensor detects whether you are sitting in front of the display and turns the screen black a few minutes after you've left. It's an optional OLED care feature that's designed to minimize burn-in by simply not showing anything when you aren't physically there to view the panel. It works pretty well based on my testing across a range of monitors using this sensor, and it brings the 32-inch 4K QD-OLED functionality in line with what Asus have offered with their WOLEDs since last year. Several other features are included straight out of the box with the PG32UCDM3, such as Dolby Vision and the Dynamic Brightness Boost HDR mode, whereas these features were added to the UCDM via a firmware update. Pretty easy to update the firmware on the older model, but of course it's easier to just have everything to begin with. If you owned an original model and you haven't updated and you are wondering whether those things are new, you can get them on the 2024 model via the latest firmware. Pretty much everything else about the UCDM3 is identical to the UCDM, so if you're after more details on how the 3 model performs and its features, the original UCDM review will have you covered. Areas like factory color calibration, motion performance, color gamut, and even the design are very similar between the 2 models, so it's not worth rehashing everything here. I did fully test this monitor to confirm everything, but outside of brightness, screen coding, and a few new hardware additions, it's very similar. My overall conclusion with this new 2026 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLED panel is that, well, it's definitely better than the original panel released in 2024, but it's not that much better. If there was a 2024 model and a 2026 model with broadly similar features available at the same price, I'd definitely get the 2026 version without question. But I don't think I'd be willing to spend all that much more to get a 2026 panel. A little bit more, sure, but it's just not a substantial difference. In real scene HDR brightness, you might find the 2026 panel is a little brighter, but without an increase to peak brightness and without fixing panel dimming, the benefits are limited to certain scenes. The gains are more substantial in the True Black HDR mode, but I don't think it's the preferred mode with most gamers. The panel coding improvements are nice and make the screen a bit more usable in bright environments. However, again, it's not a revolutionary change, it's just an iterative step. The 2026 panel is set to be deployed across several monitors from the main monitor brands. Obviously here I've tested the Asus PG32UCDM3, but it's also going to be in the Gigabyte MO32U24, the MSI MPG322UR-X24 and MAG321UP-X24, and the Samsung Odyssey G80SH, with I'm sure more options on the way. On the PG32UCDM3, we can talk a bit about the real-world pricing implications. This display is set to debut at $1,300 US, which is very expensive for this display spec considering 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLEDs start at around $900 US today. However, it's the same MSRP as the original model, so in some regions you might see the new and old variants at the same price, in which case, just get the new version. Across the last year though, it's been common to find the PG32UCDM for $1,200 US, with occasional discounts to $1,000 or below. Similar story for the PG32UCDMR, which fluctuates between $1,200 and $1,300. When we're talking about $1,300 for the new version versus $1,200 for the old version, I'd probably say it's worth spending the extra 8% on the UCDM3, but I couldn't justify any higher price difference. Gigabyte also told us at CES that their version using this panel, the MO32U24, will debut at $850 US, which should be a similar price to its predecessor, the MO32U2. I don't know whether that's a final price, as the last few times Gigabyte have told me one price, only for the real price to be higher at launch, but that also sounds promising for the 2026 model's value proposition. So anyway, that's it for this one. As I said earlier in this review, if you want more details on this specific Asus monitor, go back and check out our PG32UCDM review from 2024, which has plenty more details into how this monitor performs. As always, if you want to support Monitors Unboxed and the independent testing that we do, the best way to do that is via Patreon. Links to that is in the description. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, Discord, chat, monthly live streams, and plenty more. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.